Disclaimer. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. It is based on historical sources and interpretations, and is not intended to promote any political ideology or viewpoint. Viewer discretion is advised. Work was not always identity, even in America. For much of early American history, labor was a necessity, but it did not define a person's entire existence. People worked to feed their families, maintain farms, or trade goods. Time was structured by seasons, sunlight, and communal rituals, not by mechanical clocks or corporate schedules. A farmer in colonial Massachusetts measured the success of a harvest by the yield and the survival of the family, not by how quickly or efficiently tasks were completed compared to others. Identity existed independently of work. The Industrial Revolution in the United States fundamentally altered this pattern. Factories, railroads, and later corporate offices centralized labor and abstracted it from life. In cities like Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Chicago, people were employed not on land they owned, but in buildings where their labor became part of a larger machine. Time, rather than output, became the metric. Workers were monitored by the clock, by managers, and later by assembly line metrics. Efficiency became the new moral standard. Being present on time became more important than skill or creativity. Labor was no longer a tool for living. It became a framework imposed on life itself. People adapted quietly. Families reorganized their schedules around factory shifts. Meals and social activities were timed to accommodate work hours. Children observed adults subordinating their lives to schedules and routines. Schools in America adopted similar structures. Bells regulated the day. Obedience became a prerequisite, and classrooms mirrored the industrial workplace. Discipline was emphasized over exploration. Routine embedded itself into American life. Productivity became moralized in the 20th century. Henry Ford's assembly line in Detroit exemplified this shift. Workers were timed, tasks were measured, and efficiency was elevated to virtue. Laziness was stigmatized. Overwork was praised. The rise of corporate America in the 1950s and 1960s reinforced this ideology. Companies like IBM and General Electric promoted a culture where loyalty, long hours, and dedication were moral markers. Rest was tolerated only as a necessary preparation to continue working. Leisure was a temporary interruption, not a right. Hobbies were measured for utility, not enjoyment. Personal time became part of the labor economy. Debt became intertwined with identity. Post-World War II, the GI Bill allowed veterans to pursue higher education, but it also introduced long-term obligations. Student loans, mortgages, and consumer credit became mechanisms by which Americans invested in participation. Failure to keep up financially was perceived as a personal flaw rather than structural reality. The promise of the American dream, home ownership, college degrees, stable jobs, created pressure to perform, comply, and overextend. Identity and labor became inseparable. Who you were was what you did, and how well you did it. The rise of office culture in mid-century America accelerated this transformation. Middle management, open-plan offices, and the corporate ladder required workers to be present mentally and emotionally, not just physically. Networking, volunteering for extra projects, and showing loyalty became markers of worth. Performance metrics went beyond the workplace. Social gatherings, clubs, and civic participation were evaluated through the lens of productivity and visibility. Rest, idleness, or detachment was subtly penalized. By the late 20th century, the concept of hustle had permeated American life. The Silicon Valley startup culture of the 1980s and 1990s normalized extreme dedication. Founders, employees, and interns measured value in hours worked, emails sent, and visibility achieved. Work became synonymous with purpose, self-worth, and identity. Burnout was inevitable but valorized. Those who took breaks were seen as less committed. Rest became a luxury. Overwork became honor. Digital technology amplified these pressures in the 21st century. Smartphones, email, and social media blurred the line between work and personal life. Algorithms in platforms like LinkedIn or Facebook highlighted achievement, visibility, and performance, subtly enforcing compliance. Freelancers and gig economy workers in America, from Uber drivers to freelance coders, experienced constant pressure to be productive, available, and responsive. Work was everywhere, all the time, mediated by technology. American identity had become inseparable from labor. Success was measured by hours, output, and visibility. Failure was moralized, not contextualized. Debt, overwork, and competition reinforced this culture. Even leisure and personal relationships were interpreted through the lens of productivity. Identity was conditional, fragile, and constantly evaluated. The culture of hustle, the moralization of efficiency, and the expectation that every minute must yield measurable output became self-perpetuating norms. By the time these pressures became apparent, they felt natural, questioning them felt irresponsible. Slowing down felt dangerous. Disconnecting felt like failure. The system did not need overt enforcement. People enforced it themselves. Social norms, internalized guilt, and cultural expectations maintained compliance. Work did not conquer identity through coercion. It replaced identity through normalization. From colonial farms to corporate offices to digital platforms, the story of work in America is one of transformation. Labor shifted from a tool to live by into a framework that defined life itself. Identity became synonymous with productivity, compliance, and performance. Rest and leisure became conditional. Participation in the system required continuous engagement. And the lessons were clear. In America, who you are became inseparable from what you do. As the 20th century progressed, work in America became more than a means to live. It became a measure of character. The post-World War to economic boom promised prosperity, but it also created new pressures. The GI Bill allowed millions of veterans to attend college, buy homes, and build careers, but it also introduced long-term financial obligations. Student loans, mortgages, and consumer debt became intertwined with identity. To fall behind financially was not just a setback, it was a moral failure. Success became proof of discipline, while failure implied weakness. The promise of the American dream created constant pressure to work harder, achieve more, and never pause. Corporate culture reinforced this transformation. In the 1950s and 1960s, office life in cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco emphasized hierarchy, visibility, and loyalty. Middle management became a gatekeeper for ambition. Open-plan offices, cubicles, and performance reviews subtly monitored employees' compliance. Extra hours, networking, and voluntary overtime were rewarded socially and economically. Employees learned that work was not a transaction, it was an identity. Those who could not or would not participate fully were sidelined, socially and professionally. Burnout became a natural outcome. Emotional exhaustion, physical fatigue, and a constant sense of inadequacy became common in white-collar America. The workweek expanded, even without formal mandates. Employees internalized corporate expectations. Sleep was sacrificed, meals were skipped or rushed. Exercise became a chore rather than restoration. Personal relationships often suffered, as loyalty to work replaced family or friends. Stress became a badge of honor. Anxiety was proof of engagement. Success was always relative, constantly measured against peers and colleagues. Debt amplified these pressures. Millennials and Gen Z, burdened with student loans and rising living costs, faced a new form of identity pressure. The choice of career, location, or even relationship often depended on financial calculations. Independence required income, which demanded hours, effort, and visibility. Failure to earn enough or falling behind peers was internalized as personal failure, not systemic reality. In this way, the financial system subtly enforced participation in the culture of work. Debt created compliance. Debt created identity. The rise of the gig economy in the 21st century intensified these dynamics. Platforms like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and freelance marketplaces transformed work into constant availability. Autonomy was framed as freedom, but it disguised obligation. Ratings, reviews, and algorithmic prioritization monitored compliance continuously. Workers self-regulated, constantly optimizing performance, because the system incentivized visibility and punished inactivity. Labor became inseparable from identity. Being productive was not optional. It was proof of belonging. Digital technology further blurred boundaries. Smartphones, email, and social media created a culture of perpetual engagement. Notifications became reminders of obligation. Social media highlighted success, productivity, and visibility. Algorithms amplified high-output individuals while ignoring those who slowed down. Public perception became a constant performance review. People worked not only to survive but to maintain reputation and social validation. Identity became a metric visible to peers, employers, and strangers alike. The emotional cost was high. Anxiety disorders, depression, stress-related illnesses, and sleep deprivation rose dramatically. Physical health suffered alongside mental health. Chronic fatigue, heart disease, and gastrointestinal issues became widespread, yet the culture celebrated overwork. Burnout was valorized as evidence of commitment. Exhaustion became a signal of moral worth. People continued to push themselves, not because they were forced, but because they had internalized the expectation that identity depended on productivity. American media reinforced these values. Success narratives, productivity advice, motivational speakers, and life hacks saturated attention. The message was clear: rest was temporary, overwork was virtuous, and leisure was secondary. Work became the axis of moral evaluation. Personal worth was measured in hours, output, and achievement. This cultural reinforcement ensured compliance without coercion. People maintained extreme workloads voluntarily, internalizing the system as common sense. Fear and competition intensified compliance. Fear of falling behind peers, fear of losing jobs, and fear of social judgment created self-discipline. Individuals extended work hours, pursued multiple income streams, and sacrificed personal time. The boundaries between work and life dissolved. Temporary measures-long hours, side hustles, continuous availability became permanent expectations. The workplace trained people to self-regulate, internalize stress, and convert identity into labour. By the 21st century, these patterns were entrenched. Millennials and Gen Z, navigating student debt, unstable housing, and competitive job markets, inherited a culture where work defined worth. Side hustles, freelance contracts, and remote work blurred the distinction between life and labour. Autonomy disguised obligation. Flexibility masked constant engagement. Even leisure became performance. Hobbies, travel, and personal projects were justified by efficiency or monetization. Identity and labour were inseparable, enforced not by authority but by internalized expectation and social norms. In America, success became moral, overwork became valorized, and rest became conditional. Debt, social pressure, and technological oversight maintained compliance. Participation in this system ensured belonging, while deviation implied failure. Identity had become synonymous with work. The culture of hustle, the moralization of efficiency, and the expectation that every minute must yield measurable output became ingrained, unquestioned, and self-reinforcing. And through all of this, Americans consented not because they were coerced, but because the system made non-participation socially, financially, and psychologically costly. Work was no longer just labour. It was who they were. By the 2010s, the consequences of a culture that equated identity with work had become impossible to ignore. American workers across industries reported high levels of stress, anxiety, and burnout. Studies from the American Psychological Association and the Centers for Disease Control confirmed what many had already felt. Overwork was literally making people sick. Long hours, digital hyperconnectivity, and constant performance evaluation created chronic stress. Mental health crises, substance abuse, and declining physical health were common. In some cases, ambition and productivity, once celebrated, became destructive. Yet, paradoxically, the system appeared stable. Work was normalized, embedded in law, social expectation, and culture. Even when Americans protested, they did so within approved channels, labor unions, corporate feedback surveys, wellness programs, and productivity workshops. Change from the bottom up was slow. Participation provided legitimacy without redistributing power. Individuals argued for more vacation time or flexible hours, but the structure of work itself remained intact. The norms of hustle, debt, and continuous availability were rarely questioned at their root. Resistance emerged, but it was often co-opted. Movements like Occupy Wall Street, which began in 2011, highlighted economic inequality and the burdens of debt, yet the cultural expectation to work and hustle persisted. Employees embraced quiet quitting, reduced hours, or side hustles for autonomy, but only within the boundaries of the system. The gig economy framed these shifts as freedom, masking structural constraints. Algorithms measured compliance and engagement in new ways. Social media amplified visible productivity while silencing alternative models of life and work. Even rebellion had to be performative and visible to be validated. Despite these pressures, a counterculture of balance began to grow. Wellness trends, meditation apps, flexible work arrangements, and remote employment offered partial relief. Silicon Valley companies introduced nap rooms, free meals, and yoga classes as symbolic concessions. While sometimes superficial, these changes represented recognition. The human body and mind could not sustain the extreme demands of continuous performance indefinitely. Americans began experimenting with new relationships to labour, questioning whether identity should be so dependent on output, and exploring ways to integrate work with meaningful life outside the office. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this reckoning. Millions of Americans suddenly worked from home, navigating childcare, disrupted routines, and blurred boundaries between work and personal life. The abrupt shift forced a cultural reflection. How much of work was essential and how much was performative? Companies realized productivity could be maintained remotely, challenging decades of embedded norms about presenteeism, visibility, and constant availability. Americans reconsidered priorities. Work was still central, but the definition of efficiency, success, and participation began to change. Technology remained a double-edged sword. Platforms like Slack, Zoom, and Google Workspace facilitated remote work but also blurred boundaries further. Notifications and instant messaging reinforced availability. Yet the same tools allowed autonomy, flexibility, and personal agency. The question of balance became central to American culture. How can one participate in work while preserving mental health, family connections, and personal identity? This struggle defined the 2020s and set the stage for future debates. Education also evolved in response. American universities, once engines of debt and competition, began offering wellness programs, mental health counseling, and discussions about work-life balance. Entrepreneurship programs emphasized sustainable business practices. Internship structures were re-evaluated to prevent exploitation. Financial literacy became part of curricula, teaching students not only how to earn but also how to navigate debt and avoid being consumed by work. Slowly, awareness of systemic pressures increased, though cultural expectations remained powerful. Looking forward, the story of work in America is one of negotiation. Identity, labour, debt, and autonomy are interwoven, but cracks in the old system provide openings for change. Millennials and Gen Z are experimenting with new definitions of success, emphasizing flexibility, meaningful work, and balance. Startups and corporations are re-evaluating expectations for hours, visibility, and overwork. Remote work, digital tools, and cultural shifts challenge the assumption that labour must dominate identity. Yet the legacy of decades of hustle culture, debt, and normalised overwork continues to influence behaviour. The lesson of this history is profound. In America, identity and labour are inseparable, but they are not immutable. Systems that encourage overwork, indebtedness, and constant availability can be resisted, modified, or redesigned. Change is slow, requiring both cultural and structural shifts. Americans must negotiate between participation and autonomy, performance and well-being, ambition and identity. The future of work will be defined not only by technology or policy, but by collective choices about what it means to live, to labour, and to define oneself. Ultimately, the story of work as identity in America is neither a tale of inevitability nor of conquest. It is a story of design, adaptation, and consent. From colonial farms to Silicon Valley startups, the balance between survival, ambition, and personal fulfillment has been continually negotiated. Institutions, culture, and technology shape behaviour, yet individuals retain agency to question norms, redefine priorities, and assert boundaries. Work does not need to consume identity. Americans are learning, slowly, that it can coexist with life rather than replace it. The history of American labour is ongoing, and its consequences are immediate. Debt, digital surveillance, corporate culture, and societal expectation remain influential. Yet the emergence of wellness, remote work, and balance-focused movements shows a path forward. Identity, once inseparable from output, can be decoupled. Participation can be voluntary rather than compulsory. Autonomy can coexist with responsibility. And perhaps, for the first time in centuries, Americans may define themselves not solely by the work they do, but by the lives they choose to lead. Created and narrated by State Whisper Original Script and Production.